the thing that I noticed the first off the bat is the key changing. So it starts straight away in the key of B, very bright. But then we go to the minor instead, B minor. So we've gone from B major to B minor, really unusual thing to do, and it's just so starkly dark in that moment. I think what Paul captures is that sort of sometimes scary, sometimes brilliant misunderstanding that children have of the world around them, seeing pictures of haircuts in a barbershop window and assuming, oh, that must be all of the haircuts he's ever given.
It was the Beatles at their creative peak, really. I mean, 67 was an incredible year.
It has this sense of almost like building momentum. It's sort of, you get these little phrases, and then it kind of climbs all the way up.
They're riding their horses past a Beatles stage set with their drum kit as if to say, that's the end of that phase of our career.
There must have been quite a striking image of them with the moustaches and John with the glasses.
That was it. I thought they looked incredible. I really did, but a total change. As soon as the song came out, the street signs were stolen along Penny Lane.
1966 is drawing to a close. The nation is still reeling from the Aberfan mining disaster, which killed 144 people, mostly children, in the small Welsh village. Barbados has gained independence from the United Kingdom. Thunderbirds has just aired its final episode, and the pioneer of film and animation, Walt Disney, has died at the age of 65. Meanwhile, the Beatles, no longer burdened by the schedules of touring and performing, descend on EMI Studios to begin work on their next record, which they already know will be unplayable live. One of the first songs they attempt to record reflects on childhood and their memories of Liverpool, Penny Lane. This is UnBeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. With the help of an expert, we examine the history, writing, recording and impact of the song, while our resident musician unpicks the lyrics and music. I'm joined by Beatles expert and music industry insider David Stark, and musician and Fab Four fanatic Dave Bennett. So please me and subscribe, like and comment to UnBeatled with Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we break down one half of their 14th single, Penny Lane. So David, Penny Lane, their 14th single released as a double A-side with Strawberry Fields Forever, comes out in February 1967. What are your first initial thoughts?
Well, at that time, as you mentioned, the Beatles stopped touring at the end of August 66, and that really ended the first phase of their career. Nearly 4 years since Love Me Do had been released. They've been touring, performing non-stop for those years, and they virtually, well, they took a bit of time off, but they kind of all kept busy. John went to Spain to film How I Won the War. Paul was doing, I think, the soundtrack for the Family Way film. George was getting into the Indian music and sitar at the time. And Ringo, well, he started a building company called Bricky Builders. And so they were doing, going their own way, but only for a very short time, because we were so used to them bringing out a new single every 3 months up till then that we didn't hear anything new from them from August 66 until February 67. Now, that's 6 months is a very long time in Beatle world, but as a Beatle fan back in the day, I knew that they were recording. They'd stopped playing live. We knew they were going into the studio because the Beatles Monthly were saying this is what they want to do now. So everybody was very conscious that there was going to be something new and brilliant happening. We just didn't know what it was going to be.
So you're all very aware that the Beatles were taking some time off to become a studio band.
Yes.
Was it known that they were going to be touring again? Or?
We didn't really know at the time, but it was mentioned in their fan magazine. Yep, they've stopped touring for the moment, so we didn't know it was going to be forever. So I was very keeping an eye on it every month, what all the goings on in Beatle world. But then we knew they were in Abbey Road, and we didn't know what the outcome. We knew there was going to be a new album sometime in 67, and of course their appearances started changing, growing moustaches and getting into kind of psychedelic clothing, Swinging London, Carnaby Street, all that was really taking off then. So when it came out eventually in February 67 as another double A-side single, just as Eleanor Rigby and Yellow Submarine had been, 6 months earlier. Okay, fair enough. They want to do the same. They want to showcase 2 different songs in 2 completely different styles. And yeah, so for Beatles fans, that's twice the amount of great music to listen to on the radio, which back in those days, it was before Radio 1 started. It didn't start till September 67. So we were still listening on the BBC Light programme or on the pirate radio ships. And I think I remember listening back in the day, Radio Caroline, Radio London, but also a lot of the time on the BBC, who, because it was a double A side, would supposedly play both sides equally. But I did a bit of research, and I think Penny Lane got a lot more plays than Strawberry Fields overall.
And what was your first, just quick initial thoughts when it came out?
I thought it was incredible. Not only that, the first time the Beatles released a single in a paper-coloured sleeve with photos on it. I mean, that was the thing. So, wow, you go to the shop. I think I must have bought it on the first day of release, and you've got a fantastic sleeve as well as a single. So, yeah, that was a difference as well. So things were changing.
And Dave, what grabs you musically from Penny Lane? David at the time obviously remembers it for being a new era of the Beatles, but you coming later to it, what grabs you musically?
There's so much in this track to talk about, which we'll get through in this episode, but the thing that I noticed the first off the bat is the key changing. So it starts straight away in the key of B, very bright. But then we go to the minor instead, B minor. So we've gone from B major to B minor, really unusual thing to do, and it's just so starkly dark in that moment, which is something we see kind of in the lyrics as well, like bright images contrasted with darker images, creating this sort of sharp contrast. So we get to the minor chord, and then we go through another verse, but when we get to the chorus, it's not in B. Instead, we have a really unconventional key change downwards. Often key changes go in the upwards direction, so you'd be in B, and maybe you'd go up to C, and you'd get this kind of uplift. But instead, they're in B. We go down to A. It's still a major key, it still has a brightness to it, but compared to B, a little subdued. But I think this is one of those occasions where Paul was just following his ear, and he thought, the next chord in this sequence to me is A, so I'm going to go to A, stuff what the music theory textbooks say. And I do wonder, because at the end of this song, it does actually eventually go up to the key of B for the chorus. I do wonder whether someone like George Martin said, well, Paul, really, that would be in B major, not A major. And he said, well, let's just do that at the end, maybe, as a sort of, let's have a bit of both, compromise.
And do you think he just would have sat at the piano and that's where his fingers would have taken him?
I think so. I think that's the case.
He hears the next note and goes, I want it to be that.
That's a good question. And I think it can be an element of both there. Maybe there was a bit of sort of, is that where I want it to go? Is that sort of trying to find it? But I think ultimately, when you think B major and B minor, they might not be related chords from a sort of theoretical perspective, but from a physical perspective, it's just the change of one note in the middle. So to a piano player, it seems like a really obvious change to make. And what I love so much about this part of the song is he switches to this B minor chord. His right hand keeps doing that B minor chord, but underneath it, we get different notes which effectively make it a different chord. We get this, what's called a G sharp half diminished chord, a very jazzy chord. Paul wouldn't have been thinking that. He would have been thinking B minor, and I'm going to hit that note underneath it. And that sounds cool.
Wow, yeah, of course. So obviously, Paul's starting to think of these things. He's starting to write musically advanced songs. This isn't something that they could play at, the local theatres or the where they'd been touring previously, or the stadiums. This is something made for the studio,
100%.
Written for the studio.
Yeah, and the techniques used on this track are so commonplace today. It's almost sort of weird to think that it was ever any different. But back at the time, the standard was to effectively try and record what could have been a live performance. You know, you effectively stick a few mics up and record a band who could have been on a stage. And the Beatles, you know, at this point have already started experimenting with techniques and sounds that can't really be reproduced on stage. But here, this is a track, even from the very inception of it, they knew they weren't going to perform it live on stage. So for example, we see, rather than Paul laying down one piano track, as you would typically do, you know, hit record, perform it top to tail, stop, there's our rhythm track. Instead, he layered up 4 different keyboard parts with different piano sounds. One of the pianos was reportedly ran through a guitar amp and then through reverb. He also used a harmonium, which is a type of reed organ, just for some simple kind of droning notes. And he started the whole of Penny Lane by stacking up 4 different keyboard tracks like that. And then, because they were on 4-track recorders still, summing that all down to 1 track. And that became the keyboard track, this sort of tapestry of different keyboard sounds.
So interesting. And David, sorry. Obviously, they'd quit touring, so they were starting to experiment with these techniques. Why had they quit touring at this time? Why were they wanting to become a band?
Well, I think, they'd done it for, you know, a few years, and they were tired mentally and physically, and also having to record an album every 6 months and put out singles. And what an incredible schedule it was back in those days. But also they had a few problems during '66, particularly, first of all, in the States, with John's comment about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus, which caused incredible controversy, as we know, and burning of Beatles records and hate like mad towards them out of nowhere. Yeah. It was terrible, really. And I remember this and like, what the hell's going on? And then they went to on the tour in Southeast Asia to Manila, where they, by accident, upset the wife of the president of the Philippines by not coming to her function, which they'd been invited to. They didn't even know about it. And so they were kind of cold-shouldered by the Philippine monarchy, the government, and they were shunted out of Manila, you know, almost piled onto the plane, and they really escaped with their lives. That's what they all thought. It was a very dangerous situation, and I think that was the key, really, that they decided that was it. They didn't want any more of this, did they? So, and I don't blame them at all.
So they were not touring anymore, but also these new techniques, they were being heard elsewhere in music at the time with the Beach Boys and such.
Yeah, so Pet Sounds a year before was a real sort of inspiration for the whole Beatles, but McCartney in particular. Everything on it, from I remember him mentioning the use of inversions in the bass line, but more sort of relevant here with Penny Lane, the approach to recording, where everything is recorded quite separately and cleanly, so very much not as a group band playing together, but almost not clinically, but very carefully constructed into this quite elaborate arrangement. And we were discussing earlier, I think, God Only Knows, we can see some of that similar approach, DNA, that we see in Penny Lane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the importance and the influence of Pet Sounds can never be underestimated. Yeah. It was a very influential album, especially to Paul McCartney at the time.
So obviously they're starting to use these techniques heard on Pet Sounds. They've got more time from touring, so they're beginning to layer these pianos. They feel that they've got the time to do it, the resources to do it. Yeah. But why did they start writing Penny Lane? What was the story there?
Well, really, John had previously done a very nostalgic song with In My Life on Rubber Soul, which is one of his greatest songs, without doubt, and very reflective song. And they had discussed, I believe, around the time, writing more songs based on their childhoods, and Liverpool, obviously. So it seemed like a natural thing. And John started writing Strawberry Fields Forever whilst he was filming in Spain on How I Won the War. And I think that was a bit of an impetus for Paul to, have a go at his version of events with Penny Lane, and of course, two different takes on their home city, really.
Yeah.
Fantastic contrast between the two sides of the AA single, really, both about Liverpool, really, and things that meant so much to them.
Of course. And these two songs, reflection on their childhood, reflection on Liverpool. Obviously, they're living in London at the time. Paul is right round the corner from EMI Studios, now Abbey Road Studios. And he writes the song there with John contributing somewhat, would you say, Dave?
I think he contributed, we know that he contributed lyrically, but I also know that David Mason, who recorded the piccolo trumpet solo, which we'll be talking about later on, he commented in an interview that he was impressed that when he came in to record that solo, all four Beatles were there, even though it was really Paul's project. And he thought that their attention to each other's songs and the fact that they were all there to contribute in their own little ways, even if it was just little moments.
Well, that's interesting because the idea of the Beatles becoming four individuals, especially later on in their career, is the one that's sort of trotted out. Especially the White Album, we start thinking of them as like being uninterested in each other and feuding. So it's nice to know that Sgt. Pepper was around that time was a real
there was still
united
teamwork
moment.
there, and I think the White Album is that obviously just a year later, but that's when it starts to become three and a half solo records really. But they always were still a band, and they were all contributing to each other, even if it's just being present there, like in the physical space, hearing what's going on, and by the extension of that, Paul has to try and impress his fellow Beatles when he's talking to David Mason. I feel like it applies that pressure on him still, that friendly competition.
Of course, and they start recording these songs to be a part of the Sgt. Pepper album.
Yeah.
It obviously doesn't work out that way, but what is happening in Penny Lane? Can you run us through musically Paul's answer to Strawberry Fields Forever?
So I think the Sgt. Pepper project was really sort of stylized by its use of unusual instrumentation, at least for rock and pop music, namely on this track, orchestral instruments. So we have flutes, we have trumpets, we have flugelhorn, cor anglais, all arranged by George Martin, who, as always, was the facilitator of these things. He studied classical music at Guildhall. He very much felt in his element with classical music, so he was always able to bring those elements in, and often acted as a sort of go-between when the session musicians came in, because they were very used to sort of quite stuffy environments.
Really, thinking about it, they were upping their game from the Revolver album, and particularly just the string quartet on Eleanor Rigby, which we'll talk about, into a full-blown orchestral track for Penny Lane.
It came
really
in bit
upping
by
the
bit.
game.
Yeah, so Yesterday is probably the first example, and I think it's slowly they felt more and more confident bringing these orchestral instruments in, breaking down those barriers. Of course, the most iconic part of Penny Lane is that piccolo trumpet solo performed by David Mason. Originally, they always wanted to have a gap there for an instrumental, but originally it was performed by cor anglais, which is a far reedier, less bright instrument. You can actually hear that on some of the alternative mixes, and it's, by comparison, quite lifeless. And the story goes that McCartney was watching TV and he saw a performance of Bach's Second Brandenburg Concerto, and it features this piccolo trumpet, which is a trumpet but an octave higher than a regular trumpet. So very bright, cuts right through anything. And he thought, oh, we'll have a bit of that. And not only did he think that, he got the exact same player that he was watching on TV, David Mason. George Martin must have been well enough connected that he was able to say, well, I'll call him up. And
it's great because we spoke about in a previous episode, Lady Madonna, they just snap their fingers and they get Ronnie Scott to perform it on their record. It's just like they had
the connections there. Yeah, and I guess, well, I would say the name, at that point, obviously, if you got a call from the Beatles, you wouldn't say no. But according to the interview with David Mason, the piccolo trumpet player, he got the call from George Martin and he said, oh yeah, I'll be there tomorrow. Who is this for, by the way? And George Martin said, oh, the Beatles. And David Mason was actually quite unfamiliar with the Beatles, and he accidentally called John Lennon George Lennon at one point. But he really created such a magical moment.
Would you be able to show us?
Yeah, the piccolo trumpet solo that David Mason performed, it was dictated to him by Paul McCartney, who was sat at the piano. I imagine David Mason did quite a lot of modifying it to make it suit the instrument as well. And in fact, it's so high and so acrobatic that people for years accused it of being recorded at a slower tempo and very speeded up. But that's almost definitely not the case. But yeah, it's almost, it has this sense of almost like building momentum. It's sort of, you get these little phrases and then it kind of climbs all the way up. So really exciting, really quite short actually, it's very fleeting. There are a few other sort of little moments in the tail end of the song where the piccolo trumpet comes back through again. And there is one tiny moment at the end of the song that is only now hearable on the anthology version, but almost made it to the final cut of the track, to the point that some early promotional versions of the track that were sent out to disc jockeys had this tiny little just ending, I can't remember, something just like as simple as that. They must have made a very last minute decision to be like, actually, let's not have that. But yeah, it really makes the track.
So they're playing with these new instruments. We've got flutes, and there's also all these sound effects going on, as we can hear in the song. They're using soundscapes to create images through the music.
Yeah, there's the most noticeable one is the bell for the fireman's yard. So that kind of trying to place you in that moment with sort of decorating the scene. But there's so much in this track, all buried in. I mentioned earlier that Paul started with 4 keyboard parts, bounced down into 1. They still added 3 other tracks of piano parts on top of that. Some from George Martin, some from John Lennon. And there's also really quite buried in there, there's a double bass as well, just on occasional moments. It's one of those tracks, the more you listen to it, the more you sort of notice the moments.
These extra keyboard tracks, they seem to come in and out.
Yeah.
At different points in the song. Sometimes we get the full stack of what seems like 4 or 5, 6. Sometimes we get a smaller sounding, thinner sound.
Yeah, well, I think they constructed it in a similar way to how a modern producer would work, where they just start building without much of a plan, just sort of, we'll lay down a bit, and then as the track comes together, they think, it'd be nice to have a bit more there. So they would lay down an extra little keyboard part, particularly on the B minor bit. That chord really sticks out of the record. But for most of the song, the piano part is taking a bit more of a back seat, and that was less a mixing thing and more the fact that there were so many keyboard parts. It had this kind of dynamic contour to it.
And they added harmonium as well.
Yeah, so harmonium, often described as a reed organ, would have been a sort of Victorian era instrument that someone might have at home. Got a sort of simulation of it here on the keyboard. And Paul used it really just to create a few sort of droning notes, most clearly heard at the very end of the track when it kind of rings out and you hear this sort of like, almost like a feedback sound in the air. And I think he also put it through an amp to give it a bit more of a distorted sound. But it wasn't the only Beatles song to have harmonium on it. It's just another example of them just putting everything they could get their hands on their songs.
And they were really experimenting with this time that they were enjoying in the studio.
Very much so, and technology was improving and the Beatles' creativity was improving. And this is the incredible thing, the songwriting, especially on Penny Lane. What an absolute classic song, and musically and lyrically, I think it's one of Paul's finest lyrics of his career, really. It's very, there's so much imagery going on.
So let's discuss these images. There's a barber showing photographs of every head he's had the pleasure to know.
Yeah.
What a fun line that is.
I think for me, this song, we know this song is about their childhoods. I think what Paul captures is that sort of sometimes scary, sometimes brilliant misunderstanding that children have of the world around them. Seeing pictures of haircuts in a barbershop window and assuming, oh, that must be all of the haircuts he's ever given, just on display.
Well, it's so it's talking about people with a slight nod to Dylan Thomas, maybe in Under Milk Wood, which is You know, I think that was shown on TV in 65, 66, about a small Welsh town. But Paul's referencing the banker, the nurse, the fireman, all these different people. I mean, for a pop song in those days, it really is ahead of its time.
There's little stories popping up all over,
and they're
it?
all, and he's mashed them all together.
Yeah.
You know, and we see the way the lyrics develop is very clever indeed.
Yeah, and we got images like there's a fireman with an hourglass, and obviously we get the fireman that has the fire machine sound.
There's a bell, yeah.
There's a bell.
Yeah, I guess simulating, I guess at that time, rather than the modern siren we think of, fire machines, you know, they had a bell in them. Is that
That
right?
was it.
Yeah,
The fire engine bell.
Yeah.
Sure.
And in the pocket is a portrait of the Queen.
Yeah.
Like, these are all like great little, very British images of the...
But great imagination by Paul. Just fantastic imagination to write this stuff.
Yeah.
Really.
The shelter in the middle of a roundabout where a pretty nurse is selling poppies from a tray.
Yeah.
That's a great image, which has been
Well,
misheard in America.
I believe, I didn't know this, that apparently because in America they don't know anything about Remembrance Sunday or anything, and they thought he was singing about selling puppies on it
Oh, right.
from a tray, which is hilarious.
Well, it's such, as you said, such an English song that, I'm sure the Americans didn't quite get it.
No.
And it's discussing Paul's version of childhood. While Strawberry Fields for John was disorientating, it was confusing, he was toiling with something, it seems. Paul's is happy, it's cheeky, it's cheery, it's clever.
Yeah.
It's sort of the contrast of at least how they perceived their childhoods is on show here. Would you agree?
Yeah, John's song, Strawberry Fields, much more abstract. Paul's very positive, very direct, and very poetic, really. And it, that's the song that, as I mentioned, has probably got more airplay. And had it been released as an A-side, not as a double A, I think Penny Lane might have pipped Engelbert Humperdinck, who stopped them from reaching #1, which was a big shock back in those days.
And Strawberry Fields is, my personal favourite Beatles song ever, but I can't deny how perfect of a pop song Penny Lane is. Not archetypal by any measure. It's not, if you point to it, it's not like a typical pop song, but it perfectly serves the purpose of a pop song. So, and going back to David Mason, the piccolo trumpet player, when he was recording this, he asked, what's going to be done with the song, or what's going to happen with it, and they said, oh, it's going to be released with Strawberry Fields, and he said, not really realising himself in the moment, oh, I think this is much better than Strawberry Fields. And then John in the corner was quite offended by that remark.
Oh, really?
Oh, cheers, mate. Thanks, I wrote that one.
Okay.
But yeah, going back to the lyrics just quickly, it's also, kaleidoscopic. It's psychedelic in its own way. Whether acid or LSD at this point had an effect on Paul is debated. However, it is of the time that psychedelic imagery had been used in the Beatles' music before, especially with She Said, which we'll be doing a later episode. However, Paul is starting to utilise this sort of kaleidoscopic, swinging London 60s feel to his music in the lyrics.
To a degree, I think. I don't think he was, I think to write this song, I don't think you could really have been on drugs. I think it's so well written that I think he had to be fairly straight to do it.
But it's like nurse selling poppies from a tray, implying it's November, but we've also got the blue suburban skies. It's raining, but it's not
sunny.
at the same time. The nurse feels she's in a play. She is in a way. That's sort of like a sort of psychedelic. Are we in the know? What is reality? What is sort of...
Yeah, well, it calls back to that classic Shakespeare line, the whole world is a stage. But I think, what's so amazing about these two songs as a pair are not only they're about the two respective Beatles' childhoods, but they're both physical locations in Liverpool that you can still visit to this day. Strawberry Fields, of course, being the children's home that John would sometimes visit for sort of summer fetes and stuff. It was around the corner from his home.
Yeah, and when the the single was released, and I remember the adverts for it had the kind of maps of Liverpool.
Oh, really?
Showing Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields. So I think I've got that in my Beatles scrapbook still. So they wanted to make people aware of where they came from.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah, of course. And then even Penny Lane itself sounds like a made-up sort of street, doesn't it? It sounds like one out of a nursery rhyme. Which then plays into the images of, you know, the children's laughing at the banker never wearing a Mac and such.
And it could even be, as various films have made it happen, a woman's name, Penny Lane as well. Like
in Almost Famous.
In Almost Famous, but also before that, the Wonderwall film that George Harrison scored back in the 60s, the lead character, female character, is called Penny Lane.
I did not know that. So the song Penny Lane is released ahead of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it doesn't get to number one. The first time since Please Please Me that it didn't make the official charts company's number one.
Yeah.
So it's their first commercial, let's call it a failure. But
for the Beatles,
go that far,
But at the time, you know, as soon as it only made number two, the Beatles finished.
Yeah.
You know, failure.
Yeah.
But no, it was a magnificent double A side. But and we knew they had it in them to come up with, well, we were all waiting for the album because we kind of knew that this was an advance from the album. We didn't know it wasn't going to be on the album at that time. But yeah, so we just knew the Beatles have really upped their game and there's two incredible tracks. And when Sgt. Pepper eventually came out June the 1st, 67, obviously that's when it all went, the Summer of Love and Psychedelia really went into overdrive, especially with the cover, of which we see a little nod here. And but yeah, so it was the Beatles at their creative peak, really. I mean, 67 was an incredible year.
I think that's a good, fair assumption. Some people might prefer other albums, like other songs more, but creatively, Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, and then the rest of Pepper seems like more of a creation, a masterpiece, despite it maybe not being my favourite. It seems like more of a cohesive, creative whole.
I think they also did. They pioneered across their entire career, but from a studio perspective, from a musicality perspective, 67 is the year where they really just didn't care anymore about what anyone else thought or whether it would work in a stadium or whether it would even sell. They just wanted their visions to come to life. And both Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields were Paul and John just thinking, I want this to be what I can see in my head. I want to pull the idea out of my head and put it into a record.
Well, it still was very successful. In America, it went to number one.
Oh, it did, yes.
Which is why it would be included on the one compilation.
Absolutely. So, that was great. And also, the singles both had videos made for them as well.
Of course. That's very psychedelic as well at the time.
Yeah. And I looking at the Penny Lane video, which was filmed partly in the East End, a place called Angel Lane, where they're walking along, then in a place called Knoll Park by Sevenoaks in Kent, where they're riding horses. What's all that about? But I find it a sequence during that section where they're riding their horses past a Beatles stage set with their drum kit and instruments set up. They're riding straight past it as if to say, that's the end of that phase of our career. And then they go to a table with footmen dressed up as 18th century footmen, which is Mal Evans and Tony Bramwell dressed up as...
And Mal Evans was their roadie and confidant.
Yeah, roadie. And Tony Bramwell worked for them. And so they... and then they're sitting down at the table, and then for some reason they turn it over and it turns into chaos.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating video to watch, and also a lot of it, because you've got sequences filmed in Liverpool as well, on Penny Lane, the roundabout, and the buses with the name Penny Lane on it, and actually it's quite literal to the song. The references match the song at some point. So that it's a kind of mishmash fantasy and reality in that video.
And when that came out in '67, early '67, that must have been the first look of the Beatles as how we now know them as the Sgt. Pepper era Beatles. That must have been quite a striking image of them with the mustaches and John with the glasses.
That was it. Well, as soon as that picture sleeve was released and then the photos, oh, wow, Beatles gone weird. Moustaches, long hair, John has specs, and I thought they looked incredible. I really did, but a total change from just a few months or even weeks earlier. I mean,
no longer mop tops anymore, are they?
Yeah, well, I know I keep referencing this David Mason interview, but he said when he went into the studio and the Beatles came in, he said, "Oh, have you all been to a party?" Because he thought they were in some sort of fancy dress. And he said, "No, mate, this is how we always dress."
Well, Penny Lane, as we said, it showed them at, some would argue, their creative peak. They're becoming the most avant-garde songwriters in pop music at the time, and everyone starts to play catch-up. The Rolling Stones, you could say even the Small Faces, The Who, everyone tries to get a piece of this sort of artistic avant-garde world that the Beatles are sort of helped pioneer.
It was the way music was going for many acts.
And it's such an upbeat, colourful, happy song. At the time, Britain was at the forefront of everything. It was at the forefront of music and film, poetry and football, with England winning the World Cup, unfortunately. Celtic winning the European Cup, and Man United go on to win it the next year. What was the optimism like at that time of this sort of the youth and the culture at the time?
I'm just trying to think, because I was only 14 at the time, but I still remember it. And for me, it was just like my introduction to rock music in general was going to the Savile Theatre at the end of January '67 to see the Who for the first time, supported by the Jimi Hendrix Experience, with all the Beatles there sitting upstairs. I was downstairs. The Beatles were all there with their manager, Brian Epstein, and that was a historic evening. And that was it for me. I was totally into rock music by then. That was my first ever rock show. So everything changed, and and it became the summer of love. And with the bands like the Who, Cream, Hendrix in the States, Beach Boys, of course, but the Byrds and others. It was all progressing and changing overnight almost.
And do you think they've sums up the Beatles at their best? It's fun, it's future-looking, but it's also looking back. It's highbrow, it's lowbrow with little funny sexual innuendos and such. Does it encapsulate sort of what we like about the Beatles?
I think so. I think the Beatles really, they hit so many styles across their career. It's impossible to have one Beatles song reflect their entire output, but it definitely captures the sound of that '67 Sgt. Pepper era, with a mix of orchestral instruments, studio techniques, kaleidoscopic lyrics, cheeky sense of humour as always, and undeniable sort of pop sensibilities still through it all.
And it became so famous in its own right that nowadays the Beatles memorabilia that we buy or can buy in shops, you can buy Penny Lane road signs, and it's a tourist destination.
Oh, yes.
To go see a part of Liverpool.
As soon as the song came out, the street signs were stolen along Penny Lane, of course, and there were people trying to cash in and sell them. And I believe even one person advertised in the Times personal column that he had one for sale.
Well, if you go there today, I don't know how recently you two have been there, but they halfway down Penny Lane, there's a little area as a sort of Beatles shrine sort of photo op where they've got a sort of fake Penny Lane sign that you can pose with.
Oh, yeah.
I guess because the ones at each end of the street were just getting too many people hanging around, and the local residents probably thought that, not that keen on this.
Well, it's nice to know that areas of Liverpool are getting put into songs and are spreading across the world in the same way that, especially when you listen to a lot of American music, they're great at, self-mythologizing. And, creating an idea of what Kansas means and what New York means, what LA means. We can sing these songs and understand what they mean in these images. But now we get these images of what Liverpool is and what Penny Lane
there's
means
also there's a community centre just down from Penny Lane, which every year they do a special Beatles event to time of the Beatle Week in Liverpool. So I've been there a couple of times, and they have events there. But also the actual roundabout and the shelter, it's been a bit neglected. So there's a campaign to restore it at the moment, which I believe they're trying to get the funding to do that.
And you can still go to the barber shop. I believe it's still a barber shop.
The barber shop, I was there a few years ago, and it was still functioning. Unfortunately, it's closed.
Oh, is it closed now?
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know if anyone else is going to take it over.
I'm sure people will.
Feels like a prime location for a Beatles themed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dave Bennett, and thank you, David Stark. There you have it. Make sure to subscribe to UnBeatled on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode. Now, the only thing that's left for you to do is sit back, put on the record, relax and float downstream, as John once said. We'll see you next time for 8 days a week, a song deemed by their American label too catchy not to be released as a single.